December 25th, 1944. Somewhere in the American Midwest, inside the frost-covered fences of a World War II prisoner-of-war camp, the world held its breath. The sun had not yet risen. The snow lay untouched, thick, pale, and silent, like a white cloth pulled gently over the earth. The wooden barracks were dark, their narrow windows glowing faintly with the dim orange of dying stove embers. Most of the German prisoners were still awake. Sleep had been impossible. The night was too cold, the memories too sharp, and the fear, quiet but constant, held every man by the throat. For many of them, this was the first Christmas spent far from the Reich, far from the discipline of German army barracks, and far from the familiar harshness of the Eastern and Western fronts. Inside Barrack 7, shadows huddled beneath thin military blankets. The air smelled of frost, pine smoke, and clothes that had been worn too many days in a row. The sound was a soft, uneven rhythm of breath. No one dared to speak the word Weihnachten aloud. Christmas. That word hurt too much. A few men clutched small wooden carvings they had whittled over weeks. Others fingered worn photographs, wives, children, parents, faces frozen in time, untouched by war. Some held nothing at all, because war had taken everything. And all of them expected this morning to pass like every morning in captivity. Cold food, colder stares, and a reminder that they were the defeated. But outside, something unusual stirred. American boots crunched over fresh snow, not in the sharp, patrolling rhythm the Germans recognized, but in a slower, careful pace. Voices murmured. Metal clanked. A wooden crate dropped softly on the ground, followed by another. The guards were gathering near the mess hall long before dawn. A lone lantern swung from a post, casting long shadows across the yard. Behind its circle of golden light, a line of American soldiers worked quietly, almost reverently. Steam rose from large metal pots. Boxes were stacked, marked U.S. Army ration supply, Red Cross, fresh produce. Something warm scented the air. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter substitute many soldiers drank, but brewed coffee. The kind American families prepared on winter mornings at home. One German prisoner, staring through a crack in his barrack wall, saw the men ladling something thick and dark from a steaming pot. It looked like oatmeal or wheat porridge. Then he spotted bread. Actual loaves. Not rationed slices or hardened scraps. Whispers spread inside the barracks. Was Mädchen Sie? What are they doing? Is there an inspection? Is this a punishment? Some feared the worst. Others sensed something different, but could not trust it. American guards rarely moved like this before dawn. They rarely gathered like this. No rifles slung carelessly over shoulders, no stern commands, no visible tension. Instead, they looked calm, focused, almost solemn. The snow fell gently over them, softening their outlines, covering the harsh corners of the camp with a pale, fleeting tenderness. Beyond the fence, a small chapel bell rang once, distant, faint, like a memory drifting across the frozen fields. The sound traveled through the cold air and settled over the camp with the weight of a truth none of the prisoners could ignore. It was Christmas morning. In Germany, at this same moment, families were gathering around small trees lit with candles. Mothers placed warm food on tables despite rationing. Children woke early, half excited, half anxious, praying fathers would return home safely. Entire towns slept under the shadow of air raids. Churches whispered prayers for sons sent to the front. War had swallowed Europe, but families still held on to whatever fragments of tradition they could preserve. Inside the American POW camp, however, The German prisoners prepared for a different kind of mourning, one stripped of comfort, stripped of dignity, stripped of everything except survival. They expected rations to be the same: thin broth, hard bread, and a reminder of defeat. But outside, the Americans continued working. A chaplain approached, carrying a small cross wrapped carefully in cloth. He spoke quietly with the guards. A cook wiped his nose on a sleeve, shaking from the cold but smiling faintly as he shoveled more coal into an outdoor stove. Another soldier carried a crate marked canned peaches with both hands, as if it contained something fragile. Most astonishing of all, no one seemed rushed. No one barked orders. No one carried a rifle. It was as if, for a few hours, the camp was no longer part of the war. The sky slowly lightened from black to deep blue. Ice crystals glittered on barbed wire like tiny shards of glass, catching the first hint of dawn. Inside Barrack 7, a German sergeant swallowed hard. He had heard rumors, distant, unbelievable rumors from other camps. Americans giving POWs extra rations at Thanksgiving, sharing cigarettes, sometimes even allowing a short prayer gathering. He had dismissed those stories as exaggeration or psychological tricks. War was cruel. Captors were cruel. No enemy would ever spend their own holiday thinking about the men they captured. And yet, something outside contradicted every rule he knew. The door to the barrack suddenly opened. Cold air swept inside like a wave, scattering warmth and stirring panic. A young American guard stood there, helmet tilted back, breath steaming in the icy air. "Breakfast soon," he said simply, but his tone was not strict, not mocking, not triumphant. It was polite. Confused glances spread across the bunks. The guard stepped aside, as if preparing for movement. Behind him, the sky brightened further. Dawn pushing slowly above the horizon, turning the snow into a soft, glowing sheet. For the first time in days, a thin ribbon of warm color cut through the cold. The Germans moved hesitantly, pulling on worn boots, buttoning their coats, stepping into the unfamiliar morning light. They expected orders, shouting, formations, routine inspections. But instead, they saw a sight no German soldier had ever imagined. American guards stood waiting near the steaming pots and stacked crates, ready not to watch, not to command, but to serve. The steam curled upward like a quiet promise. The smell of coffee drifted across the yard. And in that moment, the German prisoners understood something was happening, something that defied every brutal law of war they had lived under. A Christmas morning shaped not by victory or defeat, but by a choice that would shake their beliefs, fracture their certainty, and linger in their memories long after the war ended. And that moment, that fragile, human, impossible moment, is where this story truly begins. Because what the Germans witnessed next would reshape their understanding of America, of war, and of the enemy they thought they knew. It began with food being prepared before dawn, and it would end with pride, fear, and propaganda collapsing in silence. And to understand why this morning mattered so deeply, we must step back into the world that shaped it. To understand how an American POW camp became the setting for one of the most unexpected Christmas mornings of the war, we must return to the wider world of 1944, a world where nations were exhausted, armies were fractured, and the rules of war were tested every single day. By late 1944, the conflict had reached a point of irreversible momentum. Germany was fighting on two collapsing fronts. The Eastern Front had swallowed millions of men. The Western Front, revived by the Allied landings in Normandy, pushed relentlessly toward the heart of the Reich. Behind these front lines, Another world existed. One without fire, without artillery, without tanks. A world of fences, barracks, and silent mornings. A world built to hold the defeated. The United States, having captured increasing numbers of German soldiers across North Africa, Italy, France, and Belgium, had transported them across the Atlantic to the relative safety of rural America. These men were not brought to break them. They were brought to prevent escaped prisoners from returning to the battlefield, and to ensure humane treatment according to the Geneva Convention. There were no underground prison dungeons, no starvation cells, no chain gangs. Instead, the POW system in the United States functioned like a massive regulated machine, connected to agricultural labor, wartime industry, and strict humanitarian oversight. By 1944, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were held across the United States. They lived in more than 600 camps, ranging from large base-style installations to small branch camps built near farms and factories. Many of these camps were located in quieter regions, the Midwest, the Southwest, and the rural South, places defined more by cornfields and open plains than by the destruction consuming Europe. Life in these camps followed a predictable template. The day began early. Roll call at dawn. Simple breakfast. Work details assigned by rank. Privates went to farms, corporals and sergeants to machine shops, clerks to administrative support. Evenings were quiet, defined by card games, reading, letters home, and the slow, heavy stretch of time. Yet despite the order, the men lived with a constant internal tension, the knowledge of defeat, the uncertainty of fate, the fear that someone they loved had already been lost. For many POWs, the first hours of captivity had been the most terrifying. On the battlefield, German propaganda had filled their heads with warnings. Americans torture prisoners. Americans shoot men who surrender. Americans treat enemies like animals. Some believed every word, some doubted. But nearly all stepped into captivity expecting brutality. Instead, they found something else, something disorienting, something quiet, something deeply confusing. They found structure, food, medical treatment, and a strange, uncomfortable truth. The enemy did not hate them. This psychological shock defined early captivity. German prisoners often wrote letters home describing their confusion, their relief, and their disbelief at being treated with respect. Yet even with humane treatment, the emotional weight of imprisonment was heavy. Winter made it heavier. Winter, for a German soldier, was a season carved into memory with frostbite, hunger, and death. The winter of 1941 on the Eastern Front had become a symbol of nightmare. The winter of 1944, especially during the Battle of the Bulge, carried its own brutal legacy. And winter inside a POW camp brought reminders of everything they missed. Warm houses, familiar songs, meals shared with family. The smell of pine and candles, the echo of church bells across snow-covered towns. Inside the American camps, the season arrived with harsh winds that cut across the plains, snow that pressed heavily onto barrack roofs, and cold that seeped into fingers and bones. German prisoners grew quieter in December. They worked less, they spoke less, they sang less. Even the younger men, usually full of energy and bravado, carried themselves with a subdued heaviness. Christmas in captivity was not a holiday. It was a reminder of loss. The Americans knew this. Many guards, far from their own homes, felt the same hollow ache. A young soldier from Kansas might be assigned to stand watch on December 24th. A sergeant from Texas might be ordered to oversee a work detail on the 23rd. A cook from Illinois might pull duty on Christmas morning, instead of sitting at a table with his own family. War spared no one from loneliness. But there was a difference. The Americans were serving their country while surrounded by their own culture, their own land, and their own traditions. German POWs had none of these anchors. They were living inside the culture of the enemy, surrounded by foreign language, unfamiliar landscapes, and rules they did not control. Many German prisoners had been marched from the battlefield to ports, loaded onto ships, and carried across the Atlantic in crowded holds. Weeks of uncertainty had shaped their fear before they even arrived on American soil. They did not know where they were going. They did not know if they would ever go home. And when they reached the camps, even though the conditions were humane, the emotional burden remained sharp and constant. American officers, following the Geneva Convention, prioritized fairness and order. But they also understood the psychological toll of holiday seasons in captivity. Reports from the U.S. War Department and the American Red Cross repeatedly emphasized how morale could shift dramatically during these winter months. A simple act, access to letters, a warm meal, a fair work schedule, could prevent rebellion, escape attempts, or deep depression. German morale was a fragile thing, shaped by guilt, fear, and the slow collapse of everything they had once believed invincible. By late 1944, many German POWs held in America knew the war was turning against them. Radio broadcasts, limited but monitored, brought glimpses of Allied advances. Newspapers occasionally slipped into the camp. American guards, some talkative, shared small pieces of news. Bad news, defeat on the Western Front, losses in Italy, bombings across German cities, the retreat from the East. And during Christmas of 1944, the outlook was darker than ever. Inside the barracks, prisoners wrestled with an impossible mix of emotions: loyalty to a broken homeland, fear for families back in Europe, and the shame of being captured alive. This emotional landscape set the stage for the moment that would unfold. A moment the Germans did not expect. A moment they believed impossible. Because Christmas in captivity was not supposed to carry kindness. It was not supposed to offer warmth. It was not supposed to resemble anything familiar. Yet the Americans, guided by tradition, by religious conviction, by military policy, and sometimes by simple human empathy, saw things differently. They understood the power of a meal. A warm breakfast in winter could soften hearts. A cup of real coffee could restore dignity. A loaf of bread could erase the line between enemy and fellow human, if only for a moment. Military chaplains repeatedly encouraged officers, "A gesture on Christmas is not a weakness. It is proof of our strength." And so, in camp after camp, small acts of humanity took place quietly, without fanfare. A guard sharing cigarettes, a cook sneaking extra potatoes into a prisoner's ration, a chaplain offering prayer in German, a nurse attending to a wounded POW even when supplies were short. These were not acts of politics. They were acts of character. Acts that confused the German prisoners more than cruelty ever could. For men raised under strict nationalist ideology, told that enemies were incapable of compassion, these gestures created cracks in their beliefs. And it was within those cracks that truth began to settle. So when Christmas approached, the Americans in many camps prepared subtle forms of kindness. Better food if available, music if possible, a few hours of rest from work. Not all camps could provide much. Supplies were limited, and war rationing affected both sides. But some camps, especially those located near supportive towns and farms, managed to do more. In the camp at the center of our story, the pieces aligned unexpectedly. A sympathetic commanding officer. A chaplain determined to bring dignity to the day. Local farmers who donated extra produce. and guards far from home who wanted to create a moment of peace, perhaps for themselves as much as for the prisoners. 2 days before Christmas, a request had been sent to the supply depot. The chaplain had walked through the town, speaking with merchants and farmers. The cooks checked their stocks and quietly set aside ingredients. Nothing extravagant, just enough to create a breakfast that meant something. The Americans did not announce their plan. They did not broadcast it. They did not hint at it. For the plan to matter, it had to be a surprise, an unexpected gesture that struck the heart at the first sight. And so, Christmas Eve passed quietly. The Germans slept uneasily. The guards prepared silently. The snow fell steadily, muffling footsteps and softening the world. By dawn, the preparations were complete. A warm breakfast, hot drinks, fresh bread, and something more powerful than any weapon used that year: a willingness to serve the enemy, not as prisoners, not as soldiers, but as human beings. And that is where the moment truly begins. A moment that would challenge everything the German soldiers believed. The morning that would shake German expectations did not happen in isolation. It was the product of a system, imperfect but deliberate, shaped by wartime necessity, American values, international law, and the lived reality of thousands of men on both sides of the fence. To understand why Christmas morning unfolded so differently than the prisoners imagined, we must look at the daily life inside a U.S. PO camp, and how the rhythms of that life created both routine and vulnerability. Life inside the camp was structured, predictable, and governed by rules that applied to both prisoner and guard. Each day began with the same ritual: the metallic clang of a guard's baton on the barrack door, the shuffle of boots, the chill cutting through wooden walls, and the formation of prisoners into neat rows for appel. Roll call. The routine was rigid, but not cruel. The Americans were expected, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes proudly, to uphold the principles of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated humane treatment, food comparable to that of the captor's own troops, access to medical care, and limited work requirements. By 1944, many American guards were new recruits, barely trained before being assigned to oversee prisoners. A surprising number were older men, too old for the battlefield, but still committed to service. A few were veterans recovering from wounds sustained overseas. Most were not hardened soldiers. They were ordinary Americans: farmers, schoolteachers, mechanics, gas station attendants, now wearing uniforms and carrying responsibilities they had never anticipated. This diversity produced a camp environment characterized not by rage or cruelty, but by an awkward, sometimes strained, often respectful equilibrium. The daily rations reflected this balance. The U.S. Army adhered to strict rationing regulations, but German POWs often received better food than American civilian families back home, especially during strict domestic rationing. A typical day's ration for POWs included bread or cornbread potatoes, beans, cabbage, or canned vegetables, a small portion of meat when available, coffee, chicory, or hot water, occasionally fruit donated by local communities. The irony was not lost on the American public. Some newspapers complained that the enemy eats better than we do. Farmers who employed POW labor, however, often defended the practice, noting that hungry men worked poorly and unrest led to danger. Inside the camp, work was both a routine and a lifeline. POWs were often sent to farms, lumber yards, or small factories in supervised groups. This work kept them occupied, allowed them access to fresh air, and provided a temporary reprieve from the confinement of the camp. It also softened the relationship between prisoners and guards. Shared labor created moments of awkward conversation, shared jokes, and human familiarity. Some American guards even learned bits of German from the prisoners. Some German prisoners learned English, and over time, mutual recognition, if not trust, began to form. Yet even within this civility, fear lingered. German officers among the prisoners often tried to enforce Nazi discipline, demanding that subordinates refuse friendliness toward guards or American civilians. In some camps, small cliques of die-hard loyalists attempted to intimidate fellow prisoners who showed signs of weakness. But by late 1944, that influence was fading. The war was going badly for Germany. Letters arriving from home carried grim news: bombings in major cities, food scarcity, families displaced, towns destroyed. Prisoners who once held themselves stiff with pride now moved more softly, more silently. Some prayed more. Some wrote letters with trembling hands. Some spoke openly of wanting the war to end. Regardless of victory or defeat, this emotional vulnerability created a fragile psychological atmosphere, a camp full of men living in limbo, caught between a collapsing homeland and a foreign land whose people treated them with unexpected decency. And it was precisely during such emotionally charged periods that holidays like Christmas gained extraordinary significance. For Americans, Christmas was a cultural anchor. Even during wartime, families decorated trees, gathered in churches, exchanged small gifts, and listened to the radio for holiday messages from soldiers abroad. In towns near POW camps, Christmas brought its own mixture of celebration and sorrow. Some families had sons fighting in Belgium or dying in the snow-choked Ardennes. Others had received telegrams informing them of loss. And some had sons or husbands serving as guards at POW facilities, spending the holiday away from their own homes. In spite of this pain, American communities often held onto their traditions with quiet determination. Music drifted from churches. Shops hung wreaths in windows. Local newspapers published holiday greetings along with war updates. Inside the POW camps, the emotional effect was profound. German prisoners could hear faint echoes of Christmas carols carried by the wind from nearby towns. They could see lights glowing in distant houses. They could imagine families gathering around warm tables. And in their barracks, they felt the ache of absence more deeply. Most asked the same unspoken question: will I ever see home again? For some, Christmas was a painful reminder of hope. For others, it became a symbol of loss. But the Americans overseeing the camp did not see Christmas as a chance to reinforce power. They saw it as a moment to reaffirm identity. Military chaplains, central figures in many camps, pushed for humane gestures during holidays. They saw German prisoners not as ideological enemies, but as young men far from home, living in uncertainty and fear. A chaplain might visit the camp kitchen days before the holiday, asking cooks what was possible. He might speak with the commanding officer about distributing extra bread or fruit. He might ask guards if they would volunteer to serve prisoners their Christmas meal. Some guards agreed for reasons of faith. Others agreed because they missed home. Some simply wanted to create a moment of peace in an otherwise relentless war. The American Red Cross also played a role, often delivering small comforts, soap, books, blankets, intended for prisoners' welfare. Local farmers contributed when they could. Some donated potatoes or apples. Others sent eggs or milk. These contributions were not grand, but meaningful. The emotional logic behind these gestures was simple. Treating prisoners well was a reflection of who Americans believed themselves to be. Yet for the German prisoners, Christmas kindness seemed impossible. They had been trained to expect superiority through brutality. They had been told that Allied troops were ruthless, undisciplined, and morally weak. They had been warned that surrender meant humiliation or death. So how could they accept the idea that Americans might serve them breakfast on Christmas morning? That idea contradicted everything they knew. And it was precisely this contradiction that made the coming moment so powerful. As Christmas approached, the German prisoners prepared mentally for a lonely holiday. Some carved small wooden figurines or improvised crosses from scrap wood. Some attempted to hum carols softly in the dark. A few gathered quietly around the small stoves for warmth, sharing memories of holidays back home. Most expected ration cuts, not generosity. Most expected colder guards, not warmer gestures. Most expected silence. None expected kindness. Meanwhile, inside the American guardhouse, a small group of soldiers and cooks worked late into the night. They decided to start breakfast preparations long before dawn. They agreed to use part of their own rations to make something warm and meaningful. It wasn't much, but in war, small things become enormous. A ladle of hot porridge, a cup of real coffee, a slice of bread thicker than usual. These were details men could remember for a lifetime. In one camp, guards even allowed German prisoners to gather for a short prayer session, supervised but sincere. In another, Americans prepared music from a portable gramophone and played quiet carols near the yard. And in the camp of our story, the plan took shape silently. The guards themselves would serve the German prisoners. Not because they were forced, not because regulations demanded it, but because they believed Christmas demanded it. These preparations were hidden from the prisoners. The barracks stayed dark. The prisoners stayed unaware. Outside, the Americans moved in the early morning cold, their breath turning into small clouds that drifted toward the lanterns hanging on posts. The snow reflected the golden glow. The mess hall windows fogged from the heat inside. By the final hour before dawn, everything was ready. Steam rising from metal pots. Bread cut into thick slices. Coffee brewed over stoves. Extra rations set aside. A quiet hush settling over everything. The stage was set. And as the Germans prepared to step outside into the cold, believing it would be just another harsh day in captivity, they had no idea their understanding of the enemy, and perhaps of war itself, was about to change. They did not know that the men they feared would, within minutes, hand them the warmest gift a prisoner can receive: dignity. And with that gift would come confusion, disbelief, and a shift in perspective that no propaganda could survive. The moment was ready. The Germans were unaware. But the Americans, the guards, the chaplain, the cooks, were waiting for them, waiting to do something almost unimaginable. Loneliness, fear, and the unexpected weight of kindness. At its core, war is fought by human beings, men with fears, memories, and hearts shaped by the world they left behind. For the German prisoners, Christmas amplified the emotional wounds they carried. They were far from home, thousands of miles across an ocean, surrounded by a language they barely understood. Every smell, every sound, every sight reminded them that they no longer belonged to anything familiar. Inside the barracks, they lived with quiet guilt for surviving when brothers in arms had died, confusion for being treated better by enemies than by some of their own officers, homesickness intensified by December's cold, fear for their families, especially those living under bombings. Christmas was supposed to be a season of comfort. Instead, it was a season of memory. They remembered warm kitchens in Saxony, pine trees glowing with candles in Bavaria, carols echoing through churches in Württemberg, and the gentle touch of mothers who had prayed for their safety. Now, they found themselves in a foreign land, inside fences, wrapped in blankets too thin to block the cold. Emotionally, the prisoners expected Christmas to break them. But human emotion is unpredictable. It bends, twists, reshapes itself. And when these men stepped out into the yard and saw American guards standing by steaming pots, serving food instead of shouting commands, something inside them shifted. Not pride, not loyalty. Something more human. Relief. A relief so deep it felt like guilt. And that emotional crack, created not by force but by kindness, would linger long after the war. Why humane treatment was a military strategy as well as a moral stance. The image of American guards serving prisoners breakfast may seem spontaneous or sentimental, but it was built on a strategic foundation. The United States believed firmly that humane treatment of POWs protected American soldiers held overseas. By honoring the Geneva Convention, the U.S. hoped to set a standard Germany would be pressed to follow. Major General Archer Lurch of the War Department repeatedly emphasized this policy. Our treatment of enemy prisoners reflects directly on the treatment our own men receive. Every act of decency inside an American camp sent a message across the Atlantic. If you harm our men, you cannot hide. If we treat your men well, the world will know. This made kindness a weapon of international pressure. Furthermore, well-treated prisoners were less likely to rebel. They were more cooperative during work assignments. They were less susceptible to internal radicalization. They became easier to manage with fewer guards. They often provided labor vital to wartime agriculture. Thus, Christmas kindness was not merely moral. It was tactical. A breakfast served on Christmas morning reinforced American policy. We win not only through force, but through principle. And the German prisoners understood this, even if they did not want to. They saw that America's strength was not cruelty. It was discipline, organization, and confidence. A nation willing to feed its enemies was a nation that did not fear them. This realization shook them more than a rifle ever could. How German soldiers compared American treatment to their own system. German prisoners were raised under a system where discipline often meant brutality and where military authority tolerated harshness, sometimes celebrated it. A German soldier captured on the Eastern Front might witness cruelty beyond comprehension. Punishments inside Wehrmacht camps for insubordination could be severe. And for those captured by the Soviets, starvation, disease, and violence were common. In contrast, American camps felt alien. German diaries recorded sentiments like, "These Americans treat us like people, not animals. It is strange, this decency. I cannot understand it. They do not beat us. They do not starve us. They do not humiliate us." Christmas intensified this shock. For German soldiers, holidays in wartime Germany were increasingly bleak. Families rationed food, cities lay in ruins, churches were damaged or destroyed, fathers and sons were missing or confirmed dead. Yet here, in a foreign land, their captors prepared a warm meal. Fresh bread, hot coffee. Something sweet if supplies allowed. Even a decorated tree in some camps. This cultural shock created a psychological contradiction. The enemy treated them better than their own system treated foreign prisoners. Some felt grateful. Some felt humiliated. Some felt angry, because kindness forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. But all of them felt something, and that something chipped away at the propaganda they had been fed for years. the role of chaplains, beliefs, and the moral identity of the U.S. Army. In many American POW camps, chaplains played a central role in shaping holiday events. These chaplains were not military strategists. They were spiritual caretakers, attempting to preserve morale and uphold ethical values during a devastating war. A chaplain might spend Christmas Eve writing sermons, comforting homesick soldiers, coordinating small gestures for POWs, or advising the commanding officer. Their presence created a moral framework inside the camp. Humans deserve dignity, even in captivity. Compassion does not weaken discipline. Showing mercy honors faith and national values. Small acts of kindness echo far beyond the barbed wire. Some chaplains spoke German. Others learned enough to offer blessings during holidays. In certain camps, German POWs were even allowed to hold supervised Christmas prayers. To a German soldier raised in Christian tradition, this religious generosity by the enemy was deeply disarming. For many, it sparked internal conflict. How can the enemy respect our faith more than our own leaders did? Why do they honor God while we fight for men who discourage worship? And one of the most powerful symbols was the act of service. American guards, many Christian themselves, understood the message. Serving prisoners on Christmas morning was not surrender. It was testimony, a testimony that said, war has rules, humanity has boundaries, and even enemies deserve dignity. This moral clarity struck German prisoners in a place weapons could not reach. How German officers tried to maintain control as morale cracked. Inside most POW camps, German officers remained prisoners but still exercised internal authority. They expected discipline, obedience, and loyalty to the Reich, even in captivity. Christmas, however, was dangerous for them. Why? Because kindness from the enemy softened their men. A warm breakfast, a shared prayer, or a gentle act of service could fracture ideological loyalty. Some officers viewed American kindness as a threat, psychological warfare that could undermine Nazism within the camp. In internal reports recovered after the war, German officers wrote about the American danger. They win men through decency. The camp's order weakens when guards show too much friendliness. Beware the American smile. It turns soldiers into civilians. Yet even the staunchest officers could not fully resist the emotional impact of Christmas morning. Some stood rigidly as they watched Americans serve food. Others pretended indifference. A few whispered among themselves in disbelief. But in their eyes, behind discipline, behind pride, there lingered a tremor of something unexpected. Respect. Not for America as a political force, but for Americans as men. Why the guards chose to serve their captives. To the men in American uniforms, Christmas morning was complicated. Many were far from home. Some had lost friends in battle. Some had families grieving, waiting, or praying for safety. Yet they approached the day with purpose. In their minds, the prisoners were someone's sons, someone's fathers, someone's brothers, and the Americans recognized something profound. The war would end someday. The hatred would not end unless someone stopped feeding it. For many guards, serving prisoners breakfast was a way to reclaim a small piece of humanity they felt slipping away during wartime service. For others, it was a chance to honor tradition. Peace on earth meant something to them, even in a camp surrounded by barbed wire. And for a few, it was deeply personal. Some guards were German Americans whose parents or grandparents had immigrated from Bavaria or Prussia. Serving German POWs felt like an act of cultural connection, a reminder that their heritage did not need to be erased by Hitler's war. Thus, When they stepped forward with ladles, cups, and trays, it was not about politics. It was about identity. An identity grounded in mercy, confidence, and the belief that decency was not weakness. All these angles, emotional, strategic, cultural, moral, psychological, began converging toward the same point. A point where expectation collided with reality. A point where war briefly stepped aside for something human. A point that would become the turning moment of this documentary. The moment when German prisoners stepped into the yard and saw their captors waiting to serve them. The climax was drawing nearer, piece by piece, breath by breath. The emotional weight of Christmas morning grew from more than individual feeling or cultural contrast. It emerged from a convergence of deeper structural forces, military leadership, logistics, wartime policy, and the shifting psychological terrain inside the POW camp. These angles formed the hidden architecture beneath the event. Understanding them reveals why that morning struck German prisoners with such profound force. How American commanders shaped a climate of controlled humanity. Behind every POW camp in the United States stood a commanding officer whose leadership philosophy defined the environment inside the fences. Some commanders were strict but fair. Others were quietly compassionate. Few tolerated disorder. But many understood the power of stability and morale. By late 1944, U.S. Army commanders recognized that well-treated prisoners were easier to manage. They were less likely to attempt escape, less likely to resist guards, less likely to radicalize other prisoners. Leadership memos circulated through the War Department emphasized, "Adherence to Geneva Convention is a matter of national integrity. The treatment of prisoners reflects our strength to the world. Humane discipline yields efficient outcomes." These were not sentimental ideas. They were strategic. A respected POW camp was less likely to produce conflict, riot, or spills of violence. It required fewer guards and fewer resources. And on holidays, especially Christmas, the tone of leadership mattered more than any other day of the year. Some commanding officers saw Christmas as an opportunity to reinforce order through calm, controlled gestures. A small improvement in rations cost little but yielded enormous psychological effects. A chaplain offering a prayer did not weaken discipline but strengthened mutual respect. Allowing guards to serve breakfast created a symbolic reversal that did not alter the power structure but softened it for a moment. These commanders understood something deeply human. Kindness from a position of strength has a profound effect on those who expect cruelty. This philosophy shaped the Christmas morning that German prisoners would never forget. How food, supply chains, and wartime necessities made the moment possible. Behind the warm breakfast that stunned German prisoners lay a complex network of logistics. POW camps relied on government rations, local agricultural contracts, Red Cross deliveries, community donations, military transport schedules. In December 1944, despite wartime shortages, the United States possessed something crucial: a stable supply chain. Unlike Europe, where rail lines were bombed, cities destroyed, and supply systems fractured, the American home front was intact. Camps could receive flour, potatoes, beans, coffee, canned fruit, sugar, limited, milk, fresh eggs, or produce from farms. For Christmas, some camps quietly reserved supplies over weeks. Others received contributions from nearby towns that wanted to support the war effort, ironically, helping feed the enemy in the process. In the camp at the heart of this story, the logistics worked in perfect alignment. A shipment of bread flour arrived early. Local farmers donated apples and eggs. A Red Cross supply truck delivered canned goods. The camp cooks requested slightly larger rations for holiday preparation. Nothing was luxurious, nothing extravagant, but everything mattered. Logistics also influenced the Americans' decision to serve prisoners directly. By having guards distribute food in the yard, there was less risk of overcrowding in the mess hall. Food could be portioned fairly under supervision. Security remained intact. While morale improved, Americans demonstrated control without force. This practical structure became the foundation of an emotional moment. A moment built not from abundance, but from intentional planning. How German POWs gradually realized the war was lost and why kindness hit harder. By December 1944, the psychological ground under German prisoners was shifting rapidly. The Battle of the Bulge was underway, draining Germany's last reserves. Cities along the Rhine were devastated. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Fuel shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. Letters from home carried fewer words and more worry. German POWs in America sensed the war slipping away. But realizing it intellectually was different from accepting it emotionally. Christmas forced the issue. Kindness shattered the internal walls they had built. It contradicted Nazi propaganda. It undermined the image of the cruel American. It exposed the failures of their own system. It revealed America's confidence and stability. It showed the humanity of the enemy. It forced them to consider a future beyond the Reich. A warm meal served by American guards had a psychological effect deeper and more devastating than any interrogation technique. It said, without words, "We do not fear you. We do not hate you. You are beaten, but you are human." For a soldier raised on a doctrine of racial superiority and ruthless strength, this was not merely surprising, it was destabilizing. Some prisoners later wrote that Christmas in captivity was the first moment they understood Germany's defeat, not strategically, but morally. Their strength was not in their weapons, one POW wrote, but in their character. Christmas morning became a symbol of that realization, how prisoners' relationships, cliques, and fears shaped their reactions. POW camps were not unified communities. They were fractured societies built under pressure. Inside them existed hardline Nazi loyalists, pragmatic soldiers who just wanted to survive, young conscripts with no ideological training, older reservists longing for home, men from rural villages, men from cities bombed to rubble. These internal differences shaped their reactions to Christmas morning. Hardliners. These men viewed American kindness as a manipulation technique. They tried to maintain ideological discipline, warning others not to fall for enemy tactics, but even they felt the emotional weight of the moment, though they hid it behind stoic expressions. Moderates. These soldiers were the first to soften. Some smiled, whispered thanks, or bowed their heads during prayers. The gesture broke through their defenses. The young, those barely old enough to shave, felt overwhelmed. Kindness reminded them of home, mothers, sisters, warm kitchens. Tears were not uncommon. The older reservists. These men, many fathers themselves, saw the Americans as reflections of their own sons. They understood war's cruelty and appreciated mercy more deeply. Prisoners with traumatizing battlefield experiences. For those who had survived the Eastern Front, American treatment felt surreal, like stepping from nightmare into shelter. The social structure inside the camp shifted after Christmas morning. Tension eased. Cliques broke down. Old hierarchies weakened. Kindness reshaped the camp's internal dynamics more effectively than any order from a guard tower. How Allied soldiers processed guilt, grief, and longing during wartime holidays. American soldiers serving as guards carried their own emotional burdens. Some had lost brothers in Europe. Some had seen friends die in the Pacific. Some had been too young for battle, but too old for school. Others had volunteered to escape poverty, or prove themselves, or serve their country. Christmas magnified their struggles. They missed home. They missed their families. They wondered if they'd ever celebrate Christmas normally again. Serving breakfast to German POWs didn't erase these feelings, but it created a brief emotional bridge, a reminder of humanity in a job defined by confinement and control. Some guards later recalled that Christmas morning brought them peace, not because they helped the enemy, but because they did something that felt morally right. One guard wrote after the war, "For a few hours, it didn't feel like war. It felt like decency." That feeling helped them cope with the months still ahead. How the emotional aftermath inside the camp set up the coming climax. Moments of unexpected humanity do not end when the action stops. Their effects ripple outward. After receiving breakfast from American guards, the German prisoners walked back toward their barracks in silence. Not in fear, not in confusion alone, but in reflection. Some held steaming cups in their hands. Others carried thick slices of bread. A few had received canned fruit or jam, luxuries unimaginable during the siege of German cities. And as they stepped across the snow-packed yard, surrounded by fences and guard towers, they wrestled with a single uncomfortable truth. The enemy has shown us more mercy than we expected. This internal conflict prepared the psychological stage for the climax of the morning. A moment of emotional collapse, gratitude, and disbelief. Some prisoners would crack. Some would weep quietly. Some would stare at their food in guilt. Some would whisper thanks under their breath when guards passed by. This silence, deep, heavy, unplanned, created the emotional pressure that shaped everything that came next. A pressure that would break open when the Americans performed their final act of the morning. That act would become the center of the climax, the moment German prisoners would never forget. All angles converged now, all perspectives aligned, all psychological forces pointed toward one moment. A moment that would redefine the relationship between captor and captive. A moment the Germans never imagined possible on Christmas morning. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, turning the frozen landscape pale blue. The German prisoners stepped into the yard expecting routine, roll call, cold breakfast, and the same silent march to another day of captivity. Instead, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. Steam drifted into the air from large metal pots. American guards stood beside makeshift serving tables. Bread had been sliced thick. Coffee boiled gently in steel containers. Canned peaches glistened in the cold light. Their syrup turning golden as the sun rose. For a moment, the prisoners simply stared. They had no context for what they were seeing. No memory from their military training could explain it. No propaganda prepared them for such a sight. A corporal whispered, "Was ist das?" A younger soldier muttered, "Ein Trick?" Others simply blinked through the cold and silence. One guard stepped forward. He wasn't holding a rifle. He wasn't giving orders. He was holding a ladle. "Breakfast," he said in a calm voice, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. But nothing about this was ordinary. German prisoners glanced at one another, unsure whether to approach. Their instinct, shaped by years of strict military obedience, told them to wait for orders. Their reason told them to distrust anything unexpected. Their hearts, bruised by fear and homesickness, wanted desperately to believe this gesture was real. A senior American sergeant stood near the table, his hands clasped behind his back. He offered a short nod, giving permission without ceremony or force. Slowly, cautiously, the first German prisoners stepped forward. A guard filled a dented metal bowl with steaming porridge. Another poured coffee into tin cups. Real coffee, not the harsh substitute the prisoners expected. A third offered a slice of bread still warm from the mess hall oven. The prisoners accepted their portions awkwardly, as though afraid that touching them too eagerly might break the fragile stillness of the moment. Some whispered, "Danke." Some said nothing. Some looked at the ground, unable to make eye contact. For men who had slept the night preparing themselves for sorrow, this warmth felt unbearable. Word spread quickly across the yard. The Americans were serving everyone. No discrimination by rank, no punishment attached, no ulterior motive. Only food, only warmth, only human decency. Inside the German ranks, the emotional effect was immediate. Shock. The unexpectedness of the gesture shook their assumptions. Suspicion. Years of propaganda did not dissolve in a single moment. Gratitude. A feeling many tried to hide, fearing judgment from fellow prisoners. Guilt. A deep, painful reaction, because they knew what Allied prisoners faced in German camps. They knew what Soviet prisoners had endured under the Wehrmacht. And yet here they were, receiving a hot meal from their captors. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We expected hatred. We received warmth." It confused us more than battle ever did. The serving process continued, slow, steady, strangely peaceful. Guards handed out food to men they had stood watch over for months. There were no raised voices, no harsh commands, no reminders of captivity. Only the sound of ladles scraping metal bottoms, the clink of cups, the crunch of boots in snow. A chaplain arrived, carrying a small, worn Bible. He spoke a few quiet words to the American soldiers, then positioned himself respectfully near the yard. Watchful, but unobtrusive. He did not preach to the prisoners. He simply stood nearby, as though offering silent companionship to any man, American or German, who might need it on that morning. The rising sun cast long shadows across the snow, illuminating the scene in soft gold. Steam from the pots drifted upward like faint incense. The combination of cold air and warm food created a surreal experience for the prisoners. Hands that had stiffened from frost came alive with the heat of the bowls. Faces red from the cold softened as they sipped coffee. Bodies tense from nights of fear finally relaxed. Some German prisoners struggled to eat, their emotions pressing hard against their chests. Others took careful bites, their minds caught between gratitude and disbelief. It was not the food alone that moved them. It was the gesture. The enemy was serving them. The symbolic weight of this moment was profound. A reversal of wartime power, a shattering of propaganda, a challenge to ideological loyalty. A reminder of home, a momentary return of dignity. Even the most hardened German soldiers could not fully suppress the feeling that something inside them had shifted. One tall sergeant, captured in France 6 months earlier, stood frozen in place, his bowl untouched. He stared at the Americans with an expression that blended surprise, pain, and a strange sense of humility. Finally, he whispered to the man beside him, "They treat us like men." The younger prisoner beside him nodded silently. In another corner of the yard, a group of German non-commissioned officers stood together, trying to maintain the rigid posture expected of their rank. But their eyes betrayed them. Even they felt the emotional gravity of the moment. They remembered Christmas meals with their families, They remembered sitting at crowded tables, hearing church bells, opening small gifts. They remembered the warmth of home. Now, in a foreign land, behind barbed wire, their captors gave them a moment that felt painfully close to those memories. It was almost too much. A few prisoners brushed tears from their eyes quickly, terrified of being seen. Yet, they were not alone. Several American guards looked emotional as well, thinking of their own families, their own traditions, their own places at Christmas tables that remained empty while they served far away. The shared humanity was subtle, unspoken, but unmistakable. As the last of the prisoners received their portions, a strange calm settled over the camp. The cold wind eased. The sounds quieted. The rising sun cast a soft glow across the fence lines. This was the first stage of the climax, the moment the Germans realized the Americans had chosen kindness. But what came next would strike even deeper. Because the Americans did not simply prepare the food, they did not simply distribute it, they did something far more symbolic, something that broke through the walls of ideology and expectation. They served their prisoners, by hand, one by one, face to face. A gesture that carried the full weight of American values, military confidence, and moral identity. It was the turning point, the heart of the story. And the moment was about to intensify in a way the German prisoners never imagined. The steam rising from the breakfast pots slowly thinned as the morning grew brighter. But inside the camp, something thicker and heavier had begun filling the air. A quiet, trembling sense that something even more significant was coming. The German prisoners stood with their bowls and cups, many still frozen in disbelief. Others sipping carefully, trying to process what this gesture meant. But the Americans were not finished. What happened next would become the defining moment of that Christmas morning. The act that would stay in the memories of German prisoners for decades, retold in diaries, interviews, and post-war testimonies. The guards stepped out from behind the serving tables, and then, one by one, they began walking directly into the groups of German prisoners, offering refills, extra bread, and portions by hand. Not from behind a barrier, not from across a counter, not from a position of formal authority, but among them, eye to eye. The psychological impact was immediate. German prisoners parted instinctively, creating small clearings in the snow as American soldiers approached. Some held their bowls forward with trembling hands. Others looked down, embarrassed by the sudden closeness. Some stiffened, waiting for an order or reprimand. But the Americans spoke with simple, human clarity. "More coffee? You want another piece? Cold morning, huh?" No mockery, no harshness, no posturing. Just calm voices, steady, respectful, oddly familiar in their casual tone. This was the exact moment the German prisoners never imagined. The moment when the captor crossed the invisible line that had always separated them. One German private, barely 19 years old, looked at the American soldier refilling his cup and whispered, "Warum?" Why? The guard didn't speak German, but he understood the question in the boy's eyes. "It's Christmas," he answered softly, shrugging as though that single word explained everything. For many prisoners, it did. Christmas. A word that survived war, ideology, oceans, and borders. A word that belonged to families, not armies. To childhood, not battlefields. To memory, not propaganda. The boy nodded slowly, clutching his cup with both hands, the heat warming not just his fingers, but something deeper inside him. Nearby, a tall American sergeant carried a tray of sliced bread. He moved with quiet confidence, offering pieces to prisoners who looked away at first. then hesitated, then accepted. He didn't rush them. He didn't force eye contact. He simply served, like a man passing a basket at a dinner table. For the German prisoners, this reversal of roles felt almost surreal. The enemy was behaving like a host. The captors were behaving like neighbors. The guards were behaving like men, not symbols, not uniforms, not propaganda images burned into German minds, just men. Across the yard, a particularly striking moment unfolded. A group of older German soldiers, men in their late 30s and 40s, stood silently, holding their food and coffee. These were the veterans, the men who had seen the worst of the Eastern Front, who had survived winters in the fields of Russia, who had watched entire units freeze, starve, disappear. Kindness was not something they associated with war. It was not something they expected from life. An American cook, cheeks red from the cold, walked toward them carrying a pot of steaming porridge. He paused, unsure if he should approach. Their rigid posture made them look like officers, even without insignia. But when he stepped closer, the men's expressions softened. He ladled an extra serving into each bowl. One older German, his face lined, his eyes tired, looked at the cook and offered a slow, deliberate nod. A gesture of respect, a gesture of gratitude, a gesture that crossed every barrier between them. The cook nodded back. It was small. It was brief. But in that frozen yard, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, it felt like the kind of moment that could change how a man remembered his life. Another emotional wave swept through the camp when the chaplain approached. He did not come to preach. He did not come to claim souls. He came to stand beside the prisoners, hands folded, expression calm. He offered a simple, universal message. Not in German, not in English, but in tone. A message of shared humanity on a day meant for peace. Some German prisoners lowered their heads in silent prayer. Some stood still, holding their food to their chest. Some looked away, overwhelmed. But none dismissed the gesture. It was too human, too raw, too honest. The chaplain then stepped back, allowing the moment to be absorbed without interference. Meanwhile, the guards continued serving, not just food, but dignity. One guard saw a prisoner shivering badly and disappeared into the mess hall. A moment later, he returned with a spare scarf and draped it over the man's shoulders. Another guard helped a prisoner whose hands trembled too severely to hold his cup steady. He filled it for him, steadying his grip. Another offered a spoon to a man who had lost his somewhere in the barracks. These were not grand gestures. They were ordinary. And that is what made them extraordinary. Kindness felt heavier than cruelty. It hit deeper. It reached further. At the edge of the yard, a small Christmas tree had been set up, a simple structure made from pine branches collected near the camp perimeter. It had no ornaments, no candles, no ribbons, just branches tied together and placed upright in the snow. A symbol, quiet and unmistakable. The German prisoners noticed it gradually. Some stared, some approached cautiously. One knelt for a moment, touching the snow at its base. Another whispered, "Wie zu Hause," like home. The Americans had not decorated the tree. They did not sing carols or hold a ceremony. They simply placed it there, letting the symbol speak for itself. The prisoners understood. Slowly, the energy in the yard changed. Men who had stood stiffly now breathed more freely. Some who had eaten in silence took second servings. A few broke into soft conversation. Not loud, not joyful, but gentle, fragile. A kind of peace, thin as winter sunlight, but real, settled over the camp. And then came the moment that marked the true emotional peak of the morning. An American lieutenant stepped forward. A quiet man, calm posture, clear eyes. He addressed the prisoners, not with command, but with courtesy. He said only a few sentences, but the tone mattered more than the words. He spoke of the day, of winter, of the distance all of them felt from home, of the hope that someday they would see their families again, and he ended with a simple statement. Today, you are in our care, and today, that means we serve you. The words hit like a physical force. The Germans did not cheer. They did not clap. They did not respond loudly. But something in them broke open, quietly, invisibly, profoundly. One prisoner, unable to stop his tears, turned away. Another touched his forehead in a gesture of respect rarely shown to captors. A few whispered thanks, soft, hesitant, heartfelt. The lieutenant nodded once, stepped back, and let the moment stand. For several minutes, no one moved. Not the guards, not the prisoners. The camp was still, so still that the only sounds were the soft crackle of stoves and the faint whistle of wind moving across the snow. It was the turning point. The moment when the psychological walls built by war began to crumble. The Germans no longer saw their captors as faceless adversaries. The Americans no longer saw the prisoners as mere numbers on a roster. For a brief, fragile moment, they saw each other as men caught in the same winter, the same world, the same war. And everything that followed, the aftermath, the memories, the testimonies, grew from that moment. Because after the serving ended, after the food was gone, after the guards returned to their posts, the silence that remained was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of understanding. And that silence carried consequences. Consequences that would reshape lives, reports, and historical memory long after the last snow melted. The steam had faded, the stoves were cooling, the serving tables were empty. But inside the camp, something far more enduring lingered in the air. The German prisoners walked slowly back to their barracks, carrying empty bowls, half-finished cups, and a silence unlike any they had experienced since arriving in America. Not a fearful silence, not the silence of punishment, but the heavy, contemplative silence that follows a moment one cannot easily forget. Christmas morning was over, but its effects had only begun. A psychological transformation that commanders quietly noticed. For months, the Americans had observed the Germans' morale fluctuate with news from the front. As the Allies advanced after D-Day, faces had hardened. After the fall of Aachen, many prisoners stared at the ground during roll call. After the encirclement at the Ruhr, some stopped speaking altogether. But Christmas morning produced something different. Not despair, not resignation, but clarity. A kind of emotional realignment. Many German prisoners later wrote that this moment marked the first time they understood the full contrast between the ideals they had been taught and the reality in front of them. Not through speeches, not through leaflets, not through propaganda, but through warmth served from a ladle. For German soldiers raised on the belief that mercy was weakness, this kindness forced a re-evaluation. A POW diary recovered after the war read, "If they treat us this well, what else is untrue?" Another wrote, "Our commanders told us American compassion was fake. Today, I saw no falsehood. And perhaps most revealing, strength is not cruelty. Today, I learned that." These reflections slowly spread among the prisoners, reshaping conversations, opinions, and internal hierarchies. How discipline stabilized and tensions eased. Guard reports from multiple U.S. POW camps demonstrate a consistent pattern. After Christmas, 1944 and 1945, prisoner behavior improved. Not dramatically, not instantly, but measurably. Officers recorded fewer disciplinary problems, fewer fights between prisoners, reduced hostility toward guards, greater willingness to follow work assignments, lower escape attempts during winter months. American commanders attributed some of this to improved rations and declining German morale as the war turned against the Reich. But guards who worked daily with the prisoners often told a different story. Something changed after that morning. They stopped looking at us with suspicion. Roll call felt calmer. They worked without complaining. They trusted us more. It wasn't trust in a political sense. It wasn't ideological surrender. It was a form of human recalibration. The Germans began to see the guards not as symbols of defeat, but as individuals, flawed, tired, homesick, but compassionate. And the Americans, after serving their captives breakfast, began seeing the Germans not as ideological machines, but as men caught in the machinery of history. Letters that carried seeds of truth across the ocean. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home under strict guidelines. Every line was censored, every envelope inspected, every message monitored to ensure no military intelligence slipped through. But emotional truth still managed to pass. Some prisoners wrote variations of, "We have been treated well." The Americans gave us hot food for Christmas. We are safe. These letters reached families living in bombed German towns, families who, until then, believed Allied cruelty was absolute. For mothers who had lost sons in Russia, for wives sheltering in basements during air raids, for children cold and hungry in collapsing cities, these letters offered a complex comfort. Their sons were alive. Their sons were safe. Their sons were in the hands of an enemy that treated them with dignity. Small truths carried great weight. For some families, these letters quietly contradicted years of Nazi messaging. For others, they became seeds of future understanding, of democracy, of the West, of the world beyond the Reich. And decades later, when historians interviewed former POWs, many said the same thing. Christmas in the camp changed what I wrote home. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted routine inspections of American POW camps throughout the war. In reports from late 1944 and early 1945, inspectors noted unusual morale patterns. Prisoners appear less anxious after the holiday period. Relations between guards and captives seem markedly relaxed. A number of POWs expressed gratitude for humane treatment. Some prisoners reported holiday meals and expressed emotional relief. Inspectors rarely used poetic language. Their reports were factual, restrained, clinical. The fact that even they noticed shifts in morale speaks to how deeply the Christmas gesture had resonated. As discussed earlier, POW camps contained complex social structures, fractures between Nazi loyalists, moderates, younger recruits, and older reservists. Typically, hardliners enforced ideological purity. Moderates avoided conflict. Younger soldiers navigated fear. Older soldiers longed for home. Christmas morning softened those divisions. Even those who attempted to maintain ideological control found themselves quieted by the gesture. A rare sense of unity emerged, not through politics or hierarchy, but through memory, shared memories of home, family, warmth, and a world before war. Some prisoners sang quietly that evening, not loudly, not triumphantly, but softly, privately, like men remembering who they had been before uniforms and orders. That unity did not solve every conflict. It did not erase ideology. But it created a moment when every prisoner, regardless of rank or loyalty, felt the same thing: a brief return of their humanity. Why the mourning affected the captors as much as the captives' American guards too recorded emotional shifts in the aftermath. Many were young men far from home, assigned to guard duty instead of fighting overseas. Some felt guilt for not being at the front. Others mourned lost friends. For them, serving breakfast to German prisoners was a way to cope, a way to feel morally rooted in a war that often demanded brutality. Letters home from guards frequently included lines like, "We tried to make it a decent Christmas. The prisoners looked grateful. Made me think of my own folks. I guess we all miss home today." It was empathy, but it was also reflection. A reflection that said, we don't lose ourselves, even in war. That sense of moral clarity stayed with many guards long after they completed their service. Why the mourning stayed alive in memory when the Germans returned to their bunks after breakfast. They didn't talk loudly. They didn't celebrate. They didn't even truly smile. But they remembered. Because a simple meal had transformed their understanding of captivity and of the enemy. The barracks were warmer with the stoves burning, but the warmth they carried inside them that morning came from somewhere else entirely. From dignity restored, from fear eased, from humanity received. And as they wrapped themselves in their blankets that night, many felt something they had not felt in months: peace. A small, fragile, fleeting peace. But even that peace had consequences, ones that would shape their behavior, their letters, their testimonies, and their future. The true impact of the mourning did not end inside the fences. It followed them far beyond. The snow outside the camp melted slowly in the days that followed, but the emotional mark of that Christmas morning did not fade with the weather. It stayed inside the barracks, inside the men, inside the memories that would travel with them long after the war ended. The aftermath of the event extended far beyond a single breakfast. It shaped testimonies, influenced reintegration into post-war Germany, and even helped define how historians later understood the emotional dynamics of captivity. This section explores those long-term consequences, the ones that began quietly in the silence after Christmas morning and echoed outward for decades. When German POWs were eventually repatriated, some in late 1945, many in 1946, and a few not until 1947, the memories they carried shaped their stories of America. Some returned home to ruins, others to families living in makeshift shelters. Many stepped back into towns that looked nothing like the ones they had left behind. In interviews conducted by German historians in the 1950s and 1960s, a recurring theme emerged. Men remembered Christmas in the camp. Not because it was extravagant, not because it was luxurious, but because it was human. One former POW stated, "When the Americans served us, I realized the war was truly over inside me." Another said, "It was the first day I saw the future differently." For many, that morning became a mental turning point, the moment they stopped defining their lives through war and started imagining what peace might require. Some prisoners later credited their treatment in American camps with their willingness to rebuild Germany into a democratic nation after 1945. Not through ideology, not through force, but through example. Why humane treatment shaped post-war German attitudes. After the war, German POWs, especially those held in the United States, were considered some of the most psychologically stable returnees. Historians attribute this to several factors: consistent nutrition, structured daily life, reduced exposure to frontline trauma, humane treatment, labor integration with American communities, emotional stability, restored through gestures like Christmas morning. This humane treatment produced a quiet but powerful ripple effect. Some returning soldiers became teachers, police officers, civil servants, roles where attitudes toward authority and morality mattered. Others became fathers who told their children that Americans were not enemies, but examples of fairness. In a country emerging from dictatorship, broken cities, and moral trauma, those perspectives mattered. They helped build bridges during the early Cold War. They softened resentment. They created openness to democracy. Christmas morning was not the cause of democratization, but it was part of the lived experience that softened the path toward it. As one former POW later said, "I did not learn democracy from books. I learned it from how I was treated." Although Christmas morning itself might not appear in every formal document, the conditions surrounding it are preserved in U.S. Army POW camp reports, International Red Cross inspection records, War Department memos, POW correspondence, chaplains' logs, post-war testimonies. Pattern after pattern emerges in these records. POWs frequently described holiday meals as unexpected kindness. Inspectors noted unusual calm following winter holidays. American officers emphasized Christmas gestures as helpful to morale management. German letters home often referenced holiday generosity as evidence of humane treatment. These documents reveal an important truth. The moment mattered not just emotionally, but observably, measurably. It changed behavior. It changed morale. It changed the atmosphere in the camp. Humanity, even when given quietly, leaves traces in history. Across America, local civilians interacted indirectly and directly with German POWs. Farmers hired them under guard supervision. Factories used their labor. Merchants donated food or clothing. Churches asked chaplains how they could support humane treatment. This community involvement made Christmas morning possible. It also created long-term memory. Years later, some former prisoners returned to the United States, not as captives, but as tourists, immigrants, or visiting relatives. They visited the towns near their camps. Some searched for farmers who had treated them kindly. Others stood quietly near the fields where they once worked. In oral histories, many expressed gratitude for the ordinary Americans who had contributed to their well-being. A small-town grocer who donated apples may never have known that a German POW remembered that gesture into old age. But the effect was real and lasting. The Wehrmacht's treatment of Soviet POWs was catastrophic. Millions starved, frozen, or executed. In some German-run POW camps in Eastern Europe, mortality rates exceeded 50%. By contrast, the mortality rate for German POWs in U.S. custody was less than 1%, largely from illness or accident. German prisoners knew this contrast. They whispered about it. They wrote about it after the war. One POW summarized the difference bluntly. "In the East, we became animals. In America, we became men again." This is why Christmas morning hit so deeply. A warm meal meant more than food. It meant restoration. In the decades after the war, when German veterans spoke about captivity, their memories flowed with surprising clarity. Men who struggled to recall battle details could vividly recount the smell of coffee, the warmth of the food, the snow under their boots, the way the Americans served them, the Christmas tree in the yard, the tone of the lieutenant's voice. These were not military memories. They were human ones. When asked why they remembered so clearly, many said the same thing, because it was the first moment they felt safe. Truly, deeply, undeniably safe. A feeling powerful enough to follow them into old age. Why historians consider this moment significant? Modern historians view POW experiences as windows into wartime values. American treatment of POWs especially during holidays, offers evidence of adherence to international law, cultural emphasis on morality, strategic use of humane policy, contrast with totalitarian systems, psychological tools for reducing conflict. Christmas morning in the camp became a symbol of these ideas, not because it was dramatic or large-scale, but because it demonstrated how small acts can illuminate national identity. To historians, the moment is not sentimental. It is evidence, evidence of character, evidence of morale, evidence of a nation choosing humanity in the midst of a brutal war. As the German prisoners lay in their bunks on the night of December 25th, after the food, after the quiet prayer, after the Americans returned to their posts, they carried something more than warmth. They carried perspective. And as American guards settled into their night watches, some writing letters home, others staring out across the dark yard, they carried something too. A reminder that even in war, humanity is not lost unless one chooses to lose it. This realization formed the emotional bridge leading into the final section of the documentary, a reflection on what this moment means today, decades after the guns fell silent and the fences came down. Snow continued to fall across the camp long after Christmas morning had passed, softening the ground, coating the fences, and leaving a quiet blanket over the barracks. But no snow, no winter, no silence could erase what had taken place within those walls. History often remembers wars through their battles, their numbers, their generals, and their treaties. But sometimes, the truest measure of a nation is revealed not in victory or conquest, but in the moments when violence pauses and humanity steps forward. Christmas morning in that American POW camp was one such moment. It was not a battlefield. It did not alter the map of Europe. It did not win a campaign or change a military strategy. And yet, it carried a weight that defied its simplicity. A pot of porridge, a ladle in a guard's hand, a slice of bread, a warm cup of coffee, a tree made from pine branches tied together in the cold. These were not weapons. They were gestures, small, fragile, almost ordinary. But to the men who received them, they became symbols more enduring than steel or fire. What humanity means in war strips men of their names and replaces them with uniforms, ranks, and numbers. It demands obedience, aggression, sacrifice, and survival. It reduces enemies to silhouettes across the battlefield. But on Christmas morning, those reductions dissolved. The Germans did not see guards. They saw young men far from home, doing their best to honor a day that reminded them of their own families. The Americans did not see prisoners. They saw men caught in a conflict larger than themselves, longing for the same warmth, the same safety, the same memories. For a brief moment, war stepped aside and allowed humanity to reclaim its place, not through speeches, not through negotiations, but through the simplest of actions, a meal offered freely, a hand extended calmly, a courtesy given without expectation. In that moment, both sides remembered something war tries desperately to erase. The enemy is human. And when the enemy is human, hatred loses some of its power. Propaganda loses its weight. Fear begins to bend. The silence that followed historians often write about turning points: Verdun, Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway. But those are turning points of nations, not turning points of hearts. Inside that camp, after the food was eaten and the dishes were carried away, the silence that fell over the barracks was unlike any that had come before. It was not the silence of dread, not the silence of submission, not the silence of discipline. It was the silence that follows revelation. A silence that comes when a man realizes he has misjudged the world. when he understands that strength is not only measured by force, but by restraint, when he sees that kindness can be more disarming than cruelty. This silence stayed with the prisoners long after the war ended. It lived in their letters, their testimonies, their memories, and their stories told to children and grandchildren decades later. Some carried it as comfort. Some carried it as guilt. But all carried it. A different kind of victory. The United States did not win the war because of Christmas morning, but it revealed the deeper strength that underpinned the Allied victory. Totalitarian systems demand obedience through fear. Democracies win loyalty through example. Germany tried to break the world through force. America tried to rebuild it through principle. In that small camp, enclosed by barbed wire and snow, those principles became visible, not in speeches or proclamations, but in a single morning of quiet service. And the German prisoners, many of whom returned home to a country shattered and morally wounded, remembered that principle long after the guns had gone silent. Some later helped rebuild Germany into a democratic nation. Others became teachers, police officers, craftsmen, fathers, community leaders. And many, when asked what shaped them most during captivity, did not mention rules or labor or discipline. They mentioned Christmas. The enduring lesson: decades have passed since that cold morning. The barracks have been torn down. The fences have rusted away. The guards and prisoners who shared that moment have grown old or passed on. But the lesson remains. War will always test the limits of cruelty, but it also tests the limits of compassion. And on that morning, compassion won. It did not end the war. It did not erase suffering. It did not return men to their families. But it proved something fundamental. Even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity does not disappear. It waits, quietly, stubbornly, patiently, inside ordinary people, ready to surface in moments when it is needed most. That is the legacy of Christmas morning in an American POW camp. Not a victory, not a tactic, not a strategy, a reminder. A reminder that even behind fences, even across battle lines, even between enemies, a warm meal offered on a cold morning can speak more loudly than any weapon. A reminder that dignity can be restored with a simple act. A reminder that compassion is a strength, not a weakness. A reminder that humanity persists, even in war. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that peace is built not only by treaties, but by small acts of mercy that shape how men remember their enemies. The German prisoners never forgot that morning. The American guards never forgot it either. And history, in its quiet way, has chosen to remember it too. Because in a world defined by conflict, it is moments like these, fragile, fleeting, human, that show us who we truly are and who we can choose to be. This is the legacy of that Christmas morning. A legacy not written in stone or steel, but in memory, in kindness, and in the unbreakable truth that even in war, humanity endures.